Hello! This was definitely not how I expected my booktube debut to go. You know, I try to be funny and cute and stuff, but the world won't let me, so, you know, you do what you gotta do. We're all well aware of the protests that have ignited across the United States and throughout the world after the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. I wholeheartedly applaud the bravery of people, and especially Black people, who have been steadily going out to protest against police brutality and racism and institutionalized white supremacy. It's impossible not to see the images of the protests and not to admire the strength of the people who have been taking the time out of their day and are the week in the middle of a pandemic to fight for what's right and to fight for their rights. However, one thing that I do want to address is that it is tragic and downright appalling that a man has to die for conversations like this to resurface. And I was debating on whether or not I wanted to actually go into booktube, because I was like, well, that's too much exposition for me, and in my line of work I'm an attorney, and that's not something that it's good for me to really go into. But I do feel like I had something to say about the situation, not to Black people, but for us non-Black people as a whole. Because one thing that has annoyed me and, you know, irked me profoundly for the past weeks are videos of many non-Black people saying that it's inspiring that those movements are happening, because these movements have kick-started some very necessary change. I think that Black people, it's not my place to tell Black people what and how they should process their grief and they should process their trauma. However, I do feel like it's my place to tell non-Black people that there's not a silver lining to be found when what's in question and what we're looking at is the systematic oppression of Black people all over the world, and more importantly, what kickstarted this was the death of a human person. As a Brazilian, I feel like I have the need to explain this pretty clearly. Police brutality and racism aren't just issues of the United States of America, right? We should also take this opportunity to see and to learn more and educate ourselves more about people who have been murdered because of police brutality and because of white supremacy outside of the United States. Just to give you an example on why the conversation about racial injustice, racial inequality, and police brutality is not only something just for the United States to grapple with. Not even a month before the murder of George Floyd, João Pedro was a young Black Brazilian who was 14 years of age and was playing in his aunt's house and was shot 70 times, 70, by the police of Rio de Janeiro. The police proceeded to steal his body, hide him for 17 hours until his family found him decomposing in a coroner's office. Or even Marielle Franco. Marielle Franco was a councilwoman elected by the city of Rio de Janeiro in 2016, one of the highest voted officials in the history of the city. In the 14th of March 2018, Marielle Franco was heading back home after an event with her party, and she was shot 14 times on her face. The murder, even though it's not officially solved, has strong ties with the government of Brazil. This is a type of situation that will live worldwide. Every single country has a little bit of history with slavery, racism, and the exploitation of Black people to grapple with. And it is our duty to keep that history alive. It is our duty to keep talking about this. I, as all Latinx people, just come from a very mixed background, heritage-wise. My sister, my biological sister, she's Black and I'm not. It's an exhaustion that she carries, that even though we're sisters, right? We're raised in the same family, we have the same parents, we have the same upbringing. There's awareness that she carries that I cannot take away, even though I'm older and I should be able to do that. I can't do less just because I'm tired. She doesn't have that opportunity, and no other Black person in this world has this opportunity. And if she doesn't, and if other Black people can't, then I don't have the right to either. There's this one quote by Angela Davis that has been making the rounds on Twitter recently, where she says, "In a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We have to be anti-racist." And this is something that I grappled with for a long time, because because it's a challenge. Because when she says it's not enough to be non-racist, we have to be anti-racist, what she's saying is it's not enough for us to not dislike Black people, right? We need to actively make the world a place where Black people are not systematically oppressed. And that poses a challenge. What can you do to be anti-racist? Something that I came to the conclusion, and this is like not set in stone, this is definitely up for change. Being anti-racist means willingly put yourself in uncomfortable situations in which your entire worldview and your privileges are constantly confronted. Being anti-racist, in the end, for me, means putting myself in a position where you're constantly being exposed to hard truths, and putting yourself in a position where you are putting yourself in a place where you have to be aware and acknowledge a great deal of sorrow. Being uncomfortable and being anti-racist means that you have to constantly learn your place in contributing to that sorrow. It means constantly doing the very uncomfortable work of constantly checking yourself for racist actions and racist omissions. I was pretty active on social media after the Floyd murder. I was signing petitions and donating what I could and etc, etc. But there's still something that I sat down to think, and I was like, well, I could make more people uncomfortable. And I could do that by doing what I do best, talking a lot. And all of that led to the conclusion that I am here sitting in front of all of you today making a fool of myself to go dip my toes into the waters of Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis. Also, can we just talk about my edition? Like, Brazilian publishing has tradition of being really, really pretty, but this edition though, amazing. This Brazilian editor is called Boitempo, and they are famous for doing this really pretty progressive left-wing sort of publications, right? And I've given them far more money than I should have as a college student. Just throwing that out there. Angela Davis has been making the rounds on Twitter and social media as a whole for the past few weeks. I even found a fan cam, and
Cause I be the baddie beat, Barbie tanks, banging body beat, everybody beat, on my D, yo I gotta be, in reality, suck a D, if you doubted me, back in the back, back in the back, back in the back, back.
That was the happiest I've ever been in like a long time. Whoever did that, I thank you so much, you're the best. Angela Davis is widely renowned as an activist and as a political organizer and as someone who has struggled against systemic racism and white supremacy for longer than most of us were even born. Two books that I've seen that have been highly recommended throughout Book Twitter and BookTube are by Angela Davis are Prisons Obsolete from 2003, if I'm not mistaken, where she develops a critique of the criminal justice system and incarceration politics as a whole. And the other one is Freedom is a Constant Struggle, that came out recently. She started writing it after 2013, after the Ferguson uprisings. It's a series of essays on what freedom means in this new world that we live in. And you know, I've read the two books. Those are great, but none of them carry like the emotional baggage that Women, Race, and Class carried to me. Women, Race, and Class was the first book that I came into contact when I first started studying feminism, and I was so lucky and so privileged that I came into contact just like so early on in my education, because this book shaped my entire future education. It's been like 7 years since I first touched on this book, and it's been constantly on my mind ever since. My Twitter is basically like Angela Davis stan account as of now. Like I've been standing her so hard. But you know, being serious now, I have this really deep-seated respect for Angela Davis as a person, as an academic, as a revolutionary, as a political activist, and that respect comes from the person that she is. I read this tweet the other day by @GlendonFrancis that I'm going to read. It says, Dr. Angela Davis comes from a cohort of revolutionaries and thinkers who have been imprisoned and or executed, so it's an honor and a blessing to still have her amongst us. This is the most accurate description of Angela Davis I've seen in a long time. The fact that she's still alive and that she's still free is a testament in and itself, because it wasn't by lack of trying. Just to give you a small taste of the type of person that Angela Davis is, this is a video of an interview that they did with her when she was still in prison. She was accused of conspiring to murder. She was in the most wanted list, and then she was actually in prison, defended herself in court. It was incredible. But this is a little bit of that interview.
You ask me, you know, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. What it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
Angela Yvonne Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944 and is a renowned political activist, philosopher, scholar, and author. She's most known for her work in incarceration politics, her participation in the Black Panther movement, and for having been a political prisoner between 1971 and 1972. Her arrest, trial, and subsequent release gained worldwide traction with the campaign Free Angela Davis echoing all around the world. Her Marxist studies, allied with her upbringing as a black woman in America, gave her the peculiar and particular viewpoint that she needed in order to analyze the intersections of male supremacy, white supremacy, and class domination in America. And from that viewpoint came Women, Race, and Class. Women, Race, and Class was first published in 1981, and it's an in-depth study on how male supremacy, white supremacy, and class domination are not only interacting all the time, but they're fundamentally dependent on one another. The main argument that she makes in the book is that any effort to dismantle male supremacy will be for nothing if it is not necessarily accompanied by the same effort to dismantle white supremacy and class domination. Currently, this is known as intersectionality. It's important to know the roots and the origins of the word, and it came from works such as Women, Race, and Class. And it's important for us to get that and bear that in mind as feminists, that we owe black feminists and we owe black scholars so much of what we discuss nowadays. Women, Race, and Class has 13 chapters that read more like individual essays about different topics. Like, don't be fooled, the book is kind of thin, but this one packs a punch, and I don't have enough time in the world, unfortunately, to talk about all of this book has to offer. Because I don't have the time, and I don't have even the hard drive space to sit here and talk like for 47 hours straight about all of the things that she discusses in this book, I'm going to narrow it down to a topic that I feel is particularly interesting to the discussion at hand, and that is black womanhood. Which, it's a shame. I've been talking about this book non-stop in class for like 7 years now. I've got so many notes. I've talked about this so much, and like, to pick a single thing to talk about, it's literally, like, in this book she discusses the obsolescence of housework, the intersections between lynching, male supremacy, and rape culture. She talks about, how the debate on reproductive rights has to necessarily take into consideration forced sterilizations that disproportionately affect black women and women of color. Also, she talks about how the suffragist movement let itself be captured by white supremacy. Like, there's just so much that she talks about in here, but I literally don't have enough time to go into all of this, and it's like, you know, you're gonna have to read the book. You're gonna have to read the book. That's what it is. You're gonna have to read the book. My objective of this video is to make you pick this book up. Before we get into it, I do have 3 disclaimers. There are many discussions in this book of rape, of lynching, of blatant racism, and also there is the use of the N-word in several different instances. Angela Davis is a black woman, and I think that she is entirely in her right to use that word to get her point across. If that is something that upsets you or somehow a trigger for you, especially if you're a black person, I strongly suggest you to consider that before you pick this book up. Secondly, this book was written in 1981. This means that a couple of things that she says throughout the book, like there is a moment in the book that she references the apartheid and etc., that are not necessarily true anymore. You know, this book is 40 years old. I did have to look at my calendar to know how long has it been. I'm not good with math. I'm not good with math. I'm not a math person. That's why I'm sitting here talking about books. What I mean by that is that some things are not as accurate as they should have been, and if that's the case, I'm gonna note so accordingly. Third, I'm gonna go in depth in the topic of black womanhood, so I'm not sure if you can say an academic non-fiction book has spoilers, but if that is a thing, spoilers? Maybe? I don't know. So, let's just dive right in. Also, by the way, this is not a disclaimer, I just need to explain. I usually have 2 versions of my academic books. This version is obviously in Portuguese, as you can see by the title in the bottom. This is why it's not necessarily annotated. I do have the book on ebook format in my computer, and I use that to study because I prefer to read it in the original language when possible. Just a disclaimer that I'm going to be reading from my computer and not from this book. Just, you know, just saying. That makes 4 disclaimers. That's 4 disclaimers. I'm shit at math. Holy fucking shit. Okay. Well, the entirety of the book will discuss black women, their experiences, and their impact in the largest struggle for black liberation. There are 3 chapters/essays that I think are more relevant to discussion at hand. The first chapter, The Legacy of Slavery, Standards for a New Womanhood. The 5th chapter, The Meaning of Emancipation According to Black Women. And the 6th, English is not my first language, as you can tell. And the 6th, and the 6th chapter, you're gonna get that the way that you get that. Education and Liberation, Black Women's Perspectives. So to understand a little bit more about the impact of exploitation during slavery for black women as a whole, Angela Davis decides to turn her eyes first to the question of slavery in the United States. She does that in the first essay, The Legacy of Slavery, Standards for a New Womanhood. Angela Davis notes that while the institution of racism has been debated and researched by historians in the past, the question of the black female slaves still seems to elude most people. She specifically says that more research into what black women went through during slavery would be invaluable to analyze and to really take notice of what black women go through. But because that research wasn't available to her at the time, she then says that she will start with some tentative ideas on what and how slavery shaped the collective black womanhood psyche to this day. The first thing that she noticed is that as slaves, the labor they performed overshadowed any single aspect of their life. She was first and foremost a worker, and if the will or the need of the slave owner required so, she then would be a wife or a mother. This is an important thing to note, she argues, because even though there is this sort of cultural understanding or common conception that the majority of the female slaves were house servants, that is actually not true. For the most part, slave women worked the fields and were subjected to the same quotas and the same demands and the same punishments as their male counterparts, with the exception of the sexual abuse and the sexual violence that they were subjected to. But however, in order to be truly effective, slave owners had to undermine male supremacy within black people. The reason for that is because undermining the male supremacy of black men, they were actually reinforcing their own supremacy as the owners of the slaves. Discouraging male supremacy also meant that the slave owner's own authority would remain unquestioned, both as a white person and both as a male. This context, however, allowed for a very interesting concept to appear: the slave family. Even though slave families were constantly torn apart, destroyed, killed off, sold off, the ties of kinship, love, and affection were instrumental. The reason because Even the slightest bit of love between people is enough to preserve and maintain humanity in the direst of circumstances. The immediate effect of this is that because there was no upholding of male supremacy, there was also no division between black men and black women who were slaves at the time, and that meant that both black men and black women were united in their struggle against slavery. In fact, black women spearheaded much of the resistance against slavery. Not only they actively plotted escapades and sabotages, but they also risked their own lives, making sure that their communities and their families had resources that allowed them to educate themselves. Hold on to this information because it's going to be more relevant in a second. But just to conclude, Angela Davis says, and I quote, "This bears repeating, black women were equal to their men in the oppression they suffered. They were their men's social equals within the slave community, and they resisted slavery with a passion equal to their men's. This was one of the greatest ironies of the slave system, for it subjected women to the most ruthless exploitation conceivable, exploitation which knew no sex distinctions. The groundwork was created not only for black women to assert their equality through their social relations, but also to express it through their acts of resistance." Honest to God, it's like I am such a hoe for Angela Davis. In the next essay, The Meaning of Emancipation According to Black Women, Angela Davis continues to evaluate what it meant to be a black woman, now specifically in the period after slavery. Specifically, what she's really interested is understanding how the subsequent Reconstruction and its betrayal shaped black women's lives. As it happened in many countries that relied on slave labor in the American continent, freedom from shackles did not mean freedom from poverty and from marginalization. Angela Davis then notes that after 25 years of the abolition of slavery, the majority of black women were still field workers. Without the hold of slavery over them, however, there had to be a new sort of institution to make sure that black people were still performing the same duties in the same conditions, or sometimes in even worse conditions than the one they had in slavery, and that was the convict lease system. The convict lease system made it possible for black men and women to be imprisoned at the slightest provocation and then lent out to serve as field workers for the many plantations in the South. If that sounds familiar, you know why. Angela Davis doesn't really go in depth about the whole convict lease system and incarceration politics in this book. It's a very passing sort of note. But if you're interested in that discussion, in that debate, her book, Are Prisons Obsolete, is a really great place to start. And specifically about the convict lease system, she goes really in depth in the second chapter that is titled Slavery, Civil Rights, and Abolitionist Perspectives Towards Prison. So if this is something that you're interested in, feel free to check that out. It's really good. However, for women who are not working the fields, the only other viable option for work was domestic work. This line of work, however, was not without its perils. In fact, Angela Davis reports that sexual harassment and sexual assault was so prevalent that it was considered by the women of the time as an occupational hazard, one that would bring dire consequences to the women and their families who dared to speak out against their employers. Not only the work is grueling and difficult, Angela Davis really notes that it's really unfulfilling. The fact that these women had no sort of background or no sort of support whatsoever from any labor legislation at all, mostly because the United States still doesn't have a comprehensive labor legislation to this day, so because those women were not receiving any support from any sort of institution, like a union or, a sort of organization, this left these women who were working in domestic service to be vulnerable to workplace harassment, to violence, and severe underpay. She gets really into specifics in chapter 13 that is titled The Obsolescence of Housework, but, the short of it is that she sees that housework, domestic work as a whole, is not fulfilling because it's not productive in itself. It's like we call it reproductive work. It's something that has to be done in order for life to sustain itself. And she thinks that the real key to solve this issue is to not only socialize domestic work and housework, but also industrialize it. It's a very interesting chapter. If you're interested in the debate on housework and housework inequality and etc., that's definitely a great place to start. She offers a lot of nuance into the debate. Can I just say something though? It's because she is so sarcastic, and it's actually super funny because there's this one part in the book that she's just recounting this anecdote of two early feminists talking, right? And one is trying to get the other to sign a petition to get store clerks the right to sit down. And she's going on and on about how these women are forced to stand for like 10 hours at a time, and you know how it breaks her heart to see how tired they are. And then the other feminist turns to her and says, doesn't your maid stand on her feet for like 14 hours a day, still climbing up and down stairs? Right? Isn't like, I was like, ooh.
And
This was so fun. Like, it's pretty rare that an academic book will make you laugh out loud, but Angela Davis writes in a way that is so sarcastic and so witty that it was like, I found myself cackling throughout this book. As the years passed and with the advent of modernization of field and agricultural work, many of the women who left field work were absorbed by domestic work. In fact, just before the Second World War, roughly 59.5% of the women who had employment outside of their homes were working in domestic service. The fact that after a century of the so-called freedom, Black people and Black women specifically were still trapped in the same cycles of poverty and marginalization means that emancipation had to mean something else. And for Angela Davis, Black women were clear on what they needed in order to be emancipated. They needed the ballot, but they also needed education. In the final essay that I'm looking in this video, Education and Liberation, Black Women's Perspectives, Angela Davis notes that Black people had an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. In fact, she notes that Black people were keenly aware that education was an incredibly powerful tool against domination and slavery. Actually, in many states, the education of slaves was prohibited by law. And because it was forbidden, many of the slaves were sure that education was the key for their freedom. In that respect, Angela Davis says, and I quote, "The mystifying powers of racism often emanate from its irrational topsy-turvy logic. According to the prevailing ideology, Black people were allegedly incapable of intellectual advancement. After all, they had been chattel, naturally inferior as compared to the white epitomes of humankind. But if they really were biologically inferior, they would have manifested neither the desire nor the capability to acquire knowledge. Ergo, no prohibition of learning would have been necessary. In reality, of course, Black people had always exhibited a furious impatience as regards the acquisition of education." While the civil rights activist Frederick Douglass was by far the most famous example of slaves educating themselves and attaining their freedom, he was not the only one doing that. In fact, as Angela Davis points out in her previous essay, Black women often went through great lengths, often risking their own lives in order to ensure the communities and their families had access to education. She specifically recounts slave women foregoing whatever little rest they could get in order to spend the nights reading and trying to spell words over and over again. This eager need for education came from the realization, to borrow Angela Davis's own words, that freedom is a constant struggle. And in order to attain their freedom and their liberation, Black people were keenly aware that they needed the tools to do so, and the main one was education. The betrayal of the Reconstruction and the subsequent enforcement of Jim Crow laws halted much of the progress that might have been made for Black liberation and Black education. However, one thing that it was not able to do was to raise the significant strides Black people, and specifically Black women, made in order to educate themselves, their families, and their communities, and to use that as a tool for their own struggles for liberation. As it was then and as it is now, Black education is not merely education, it's revolution. So now, having taken a quick glance in these 3 essays, I have 2 things that I want to point out. The first thing is that because Black education is so revolutionary and so incendiary, it makes sense that the educational system, both in the United States and in other countries across the globe, are structured in a way that prevent Black people and people of color from accessing, really affordable, high-quality education. However, if we are to act as true allies, we cannot forgo the fight for education. It's important that we constantly fight for education that is quality, that is accessible, and also that instigates critical thinking. The second thing that I think that we can take from this debate, and that, Angela Davis gets across pretty straightforwardly, is that Black women have shouldered plenty of pain in their struggle for the freedom of their people. And what we as non-Black people should take from this discussion is that we have no right to demand them to do that work for us. I am in no way, shape, and form as eloquent and as in-depth as Angela Davis is in the book, but if you have a rough idea of what slavery was like in the United States, what slavery was like for Black women, and the role Black women have had historically in politically organizing, if you know that, a little bit, and you still go after Black women and ask them to educate you, what is wrong with you? Like, you're literally asking black women to take the time away from their grief, from their pain, from their trauma, to educate you and make sure that your feelings are being coddled. This is like, if you do that, and if you constantly do that, that is inflicting like a terrible violence on black women. I was reading this book, and I was reading like how Angela Davis went on about how black women were kind of like forced to be strong. They had no other choice other than be strong for their people, for the community, and to really fight for their own liberation. And while I was reading that, I was remembering that one video that I saw. I'm not going to link it here because it's a child and I don't want to expose the child, but it's this young black girl, no older than 7, and she's like in the protest and she's yelling like, no justice, no peace. All the black women that you know in your life did not have the right of a childhood where racism, racist violence, and police brutality was not a thing. That 7-year-old girl did not have the right to a childhood where she did not have to shoulder the weight of the trauma that her people went through for like hundreds of years. And like, every black woman that you meet is exhausted. They have carried this weight for so long. Look at what Angela Davis has taught us. From the first essay to the end of the book, black women have shouldered so much in order to attain what little freedom black people still have. You know, and to this day, they're still, they still have to hold the burden and the trauma of the collective black experience. They carry it in their bodies. Being in knowledge of all that and still asking black women to do the emotional labor of educate you and making sure that your feelings are not hurt is like ignorant at best, but it's terrorizing at worst. I said what I said. By asking black people to educate you, you are terrorizing black women, okay? They have had enough. They don't need to educate you. So like, the next time a black woman tells you Google is free, you should like, instead of crying about it on Twitter, you should sit down, like, pick up this book, read what black women have gone through in America ever since the first black person was taken from the shores of Africa, like Angela Davis herself said, and, grasp the sheer horror and pain these women have to endure, and then open the fucking Google website and do your goddamn research. I got a little bit carried away there. Now, I've gone on and on and on and on about how much I love this book, right? But is this book without criticism? And the answer is no. When we do academic research, we're constantly told that we have to limit our object of research. And the reason why we do that is because you have to pick a topic and stick with it. I know that because I'm particularly terrible at doing that. The reason why I'm saying this is because Angela Davis delimited her research in the history of class, gender, and racial relationships and their intersections in the United States of America. This was done with a specific focus on black women's experience throughout this period. That's super valid. That's what she set out to do, and that's what she did, and she did, tremendously well. However, what we do have to bear in mind, though, is that she's talking and discussing a specific topic in a specific cultural and historical and geographical context. The conclusions that she reaches in this book and the history that she presents in this book might not necessarily apply to every single country that has also grappled with their history of slavery and their history of black exploitation. Just as an example, there was an early 19th century, and I remember being taught this in school, there was an early 19th century census in Brazil. This census found that the average life expectancy of a slave in the early 19th century Brazil was anything from between 18 to 25 years of age. That would depend on the work that the slaves were doing. Usually field workers lived longer than miners, because miners had more, the work was more dangerous. So what I mean by that is that there was no time to form family connections. A slave that was brought from Africa was only expected to live for about a year, if that much. Like, again, I'm not saying that the United States had it easy. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the reality of slavery and the reality of exploitation in different countries very drastically. Like I said, I'm really bad with this, but the reason why I went in this tangent is that because when Angela Davis says, for example, that slave family was fundamental for slaves to be able to retain a little bit of their humanity and then, conceive the struggle and conceive resistance against the slavery, oppression, and the domination of white people. This had to be done differently in Brazil. And because it had to be done differently, because of the conditions of the exploitation of black people in Brazil, this means that it had other consequences and other effects. that are not necessarily the ones that she will point out in this book. I feel like this is a great place to A, understand the history of Black people and Black women in America, and B, I think this is a great place to start drawing comparisons to, but this is not a book that will necessarily explain or even address, and like the book doesn't set out to do this, but it's important for us to notice that this will not explain or address all the hardships and the cultural and historical differences of different sorts of racial discriminations and, white supremacist systems in other countries. Angela Davis herself acknowledges this. There was a time when she came to Brazil and she said, like, you don't need me because you have Leila Gonzalez. And Leila Gonzalez was an activist and a scholar and author who was very close friends with Angela Davis. And she wrote specifically about Black women in Brazil and Latin America as a whole. And it's amazing. It's a pity that it's not translated because it's been so fundamental in my education, and but it's important that we bear that in mind. In conclusion, it is, and I said that a couple of times, it is very rare for me to say that a book changed my life. I'm usually very critical of the books that I read. But Women, Race, and Class shaped my feminist education in a way that I don't think any other book has done. The impact that this book created in my life was astounding. And the impact that it created on feminist scholarship throughout the United States and throughout the world was also astounding. And if I can be in a position where I can make sure that more people are being made uncomfortable the same way that I did, and to learn how to be better allies, then I feel like I have to use the space and the resources that I was given to do that. If you are still interested in more works about Black feminists and Black feminism as a whole, I would strongly suggest you to take a look into Bell Hooks' amazing book, Ain't I a Woman, where she discusses a lot more about Black women in the United States and Black women in femininity. Another great book that I usually recommend for younger people or for people who are just generally unfamiliar with feminism is We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This book's great. It's also a TED Talk, so it's free to see on YouTube. It's just so simple, so straightforward. I've given it to all of my younger cousins and my younger family friends, spreading the word of feminism. I'm gonna put a GDocs link in the description below of, the references and the actual quotes from the book that I use with the timestamps, so you can, look for it in your copy of the book if you have one. Maybe my next video can be fun and cute. Maybe I can do like this cute wrap up of the books that I read, doing all the cute stuff, but I feel like this is what I need to do, and this is what my heart told me that I need to do. It felt necessary. I hope that you, watching this as a non-Black person, you were made uncomfortable just so enough that you would be intrigued to know more and to be better and to do better. I'm also going to extensively link petitions, donations, resources. I'll also link videos of Black creators on BookTube who spread a lot of Black joy that I think is also as relevant to understand as Black pain. I'm also going to link discussions of other Black people had on this book that were far more in depth than I could ever be and could ever aspire to be. Anyways, sign petitions, donate if you can. Black Lives Matter. I don't know how to end this video, so bye.